This is part 6 of the Tamiya Avante 2011 build series. So last time I ended about here. Okay, front and rear, suspension arms and everything are all put together. So the next step is to put the shocks together. I figured I would make the video at this particular point because there are some things I want to go over with regard to these particular shocks. And the rest of it beyond this is relatively straightforward, right? You put the little shock boot in, the spring holder in here with the springs, and you put the cap on and everything. There's nothing, non-trivial about that. So the first thing I want to mention is if you look in the manual, when you put the shock piston on, the manual requests specifically part number Q7, which is the shock piston with 3 holes in it. Now, I had used this when I put together the Black Special chassis, 3 holes, with the stock shock oil, and the problem there is that the shocks are underdamped and oversprung. Either whether you call it underdamped or oversprung, it's the same thing. So what I figured I would do with the standard 2011 build is to not use the 3-hole piston, but to use the 1-hole piston, both front and rear. Okay, and that would be part number Q5. Okay, so 3-hole piston's right here, not using it. That's what the manual wants you to use. I'm using the 1-hole piston. So that should give you, with the stock shock oil, it just has the effect of effectively thickening the damper oil. Okay. So I'm using that. The other thing is when you put the shock piston on, the manual asks you to put in 3.2 millimeter spacers between the bottom of the shock piston and the bottom E-clip. Now the point there is if you just have the bottom E-clip and the top E-clip, there's more than enough space in there for the shock piston to fit. There's going to be a little bit of wiggle space for the shock piston. Now, if you have that wiggle space and the suspension is moving around, then the shock piston isn't really sitting in one spot. And so the instantaneous amount of damping that you get during the very first movement of the suspension is going to be a lower damping than what you have when the piston either hits the front or the top E-clip or the bottom E-clip. And then it sets into place, and then you get your actual damping action. So to avoid that, you just put very small spacers between the E-clips and the shock pistons. This is actually pretty cool. This is the first manual I saw that asked the user to do this. I've never seen it in the Associated manuals or HPI manuals or anything like that. So this is something I might actually want to try in some of my other chassis if I notice that there is any play between the shock pistons and the E-clips. The thing is, as nice as it is, you don't actually need 3 spacers. If you put 3 spacers in and then you put the piston down, there's not enough space for the gap at the top of the shock shaft to fit the E-clip that goes on the top. So I just progressively remove 1 spacer at a time, and sure enough, on all 4 shock shafts, 2 in the front, 2 in the rear, you only actually need 1 spacer, not 3. And that should work just fine. It should be nice and tight for the shock piston. So that's another thing to point out. The other thing is these are single O-ring seal. Okay, modern shocks are double O-ring seal. So the shock actually moves around okay. I mean, there's not a whole lot of lateral play. It's still nice and solid because it has this plastic bushing that goes in to guide the shock shaft. Okay, I have some old Duratrax shocks which just have an O-ring in there. I don't think there's a plastic spacer in there, and those things have a whole bunch of play and oil leaks out quite a lot. These are okay. The shocks on the Black Special are exactly the same. I built this about 6 months ago, and I haven't noticed any oil leaking out or anything. It seems to work just fine. The only problem is with a single O-ring shock seal, you don't get as much shielding from between the inside of the shock body and the external environment, so the shock oil will get dirty quicker. Now, that's not too big of a deal if you go racing, because if you go racing, you're going to be replacing the shock oil about every week or every 2 weeks anyway. So it shouldn't matter too much. And the single O-ring may wear out faster than if you have a double O-ring seal, but by and large, it shouldn't be a big problem. Let's see, oh yes, the other thing I want to point out here, and this one's kind of important. So when you put the front shocks together, the only change I made was the single hull shock piston. Otherwise, I built it as is, no changes or anything. With the rear shocks, what I wanted to change between the Black Special build and this is to put some spacers in here, okay? Because despite the length of this shock shaft, the suspension travel goes beyond the rear ride height of the car. So if I press this down, hear that? That's the bottom of the under tray, in particular this corner right here hitting the ground. So if you want to minimize how much scraping you get to the bottom under tray, then you want to put some spacers in to the rear shocks. And what I did was I just compressed this all the way down, and I took my calipers out and tried to measure how much spacing was left between the bottom of the shock body and the bottom of the spring, and it came out to approximately 1 centimeter. It's a lot of shock travel that you actually don't get to use on the Avante. So the shocks are much longer than they actually need to be. So what I did here, I just kind of rummaged through my spare parts bin. I have a little plastic spacer in here. It's just a hard spacer. That's 5 millimeters. And then I just have 3 O-rings here. And all that together comes out to about 10 millimeters. And you want to put, if you have hard spacers and O-ring or soft spacers, make sure you put the soft spacers on the top so that when the suspension bottoms out, you still have a little bit of compression that the rubber O-rings will permit. If you do it the other way around, then the hard spacers hitting up against the bottom of the shock body, you'll still get some compression if the O-rings are on the bottom against this ball joint here, but you don't have as much of a surface here to apply pressure to. So it's better to put the O-rings on the top here, okay? So I would recommend doing that if you're building the Avante 2011. You want to try to preserve the bottom of your chassis from getting all eaten up when the suspension bottoms out. So in reality, let's see, if we put these two side by side with realistic spacers for the shocks, the rear shocks, despite their larger size, don't have that much more shock travel than the front, maybe 1 or 2 millimeters or so. And you'll notice, maybe it's hard to see because of the lighting. Let me see if I can, there we go. So you see that E-clip there, right? I'm going to press the shocks up. Because I'm limiting the shock travel by a full centimeter, the shocks don't even move up most of the shock body. So if you want to save some shock oil as well, you don't even have to fill the full shock body. You can just fill it up to maybe here or so. But I'll probably just fill it up the whole way, just because. So I just wanted to go over those bits, and let's see, one more thing actually is a little trick that I use when I assemble shocks, when I pour oil in. What most shock building guides will tell you to do is to pull the shock shaft all the way down, fill the shock body with oil, and then push the shock shaft up and then back down to get the air bubbles out from the bottom of the shock body. That does work, but it has a tendency to create small air bubbles. So what I do is I take the shock shaft and I push it up about halfway to the top. Then I fill the shock body all the way up, and then I pull the shock shaft down. So when you push this up, you're basically creating a big air bubble here. And then when you pull the shock shaft down, when you have the oil on there, this huge air bubble goes up, and it usually comes out in 1 or 2 really big air bubbles, and then you see the oil level of the shock oil drop considerably. And it just allows you to evacuate the air from the bottom of the shock body in a more efficient manner. So you just start halfway, fill up a little bit, pull the shock shaft down a bit, you'll see a big bubble come up, the oil level drops, you fill it with a little more oil, pull the shock shaft down a little more, and just keep doing that until you get all the way to the bottom. And then There may still be a little air pocket in there. So once you get it all the way down to the bottom, just push the shock shaft up to the top again, and then pull down again, and then that should evacuate most of the air bubbles. You should not have very many, if any at all, small air bubbles, which means that it'll take you less time to get all of the air out of here so that you can finish building the shock. Okay, so you can apply that to any shock. It doesn't have to be these in particular. Any shock, try that out. It for me at least, it works better than the standard approach toward filling the shocks with oil. So that is the end of part 6. And so I'm just going to finish, building these shocks, mounting them on the chassis. Okay, that's a pretty straightforward procedure. You just got some mount screws here. There's like a ball type joint. The end of this ball is ultimately what holds a tie rod down to hold these two shocks together. It's like an upper brace to the front shock tower or the rear shock tower. It also goes on the front. I did not mount those on the Black Special. As you can see, those balls are just open there. There's nothing mounted to them, because when they're there, if you want to remove the body, you got to take those tie rods off. So I figured I'd just keep them off, and it doesn't seem to affect the suspension, rigidity in any way. So there's really no point in using them. Okay, so mount the shocks, and mounting the bottom of the rear shocks is a bit of a pain, because you use a little shaft here with an E-clip. So, more modern chassis, you just have a screw that mounts the bottom shock joint into the suspension arm. This is a little more involved. So if you want to actually take these shocks off, you have to take this E-clip off. Okay. Then after that, we get to, let's see, the front shocks, and then we play around with the electronics. So I think what I'll do is, after I have the electronics all mounted in there, because this is a pretty simple step, I'll make another video. And then after that, I'll do the tires and the driver figure and everything. Still debating about what kinds of electronics I want to mount. I mean, I have the servo and the receiver already, but the motor and speed control I'm still deciding on. I did order a Turnigy Trackstar 100 amp speed control. Should be sufficient. I also ordered a 1000 kV Hobby King motor, but if I want to run something a little more rugged, I do have a Reedy-Sonic 7.5 that I am toying with the idea of putting this into the Avante, at least as a temporary measure if I want to go racing with it. So yeah, that's it for now.